Drafting for a chance at $50,000. That's what we're doing today. We're over at the FFPC. We are in the $35 Superflex Best Ball Tournament. This is one, Shawn, that me and you have had a lot of fun in over the years. Last year, getting to the finals of it again. That is our goal this season. So I'm excited for it. And we're going to do some different stuff. We like to change things up. But I think with the 9th slot that we have today, we may be able to do some things that we want to do based on what the RotoViz Tools are going to tell us that may be optimal for success. We are going to hopefully start this off, Shawn. Our perfect draft start here, I think, is a Justin Fields, Christian McCaffrey start would be the ideal start for us. I think that's what we're trying to say. The real truth is that myself and Shawn jumped onto this a little bit later, and we have 2 picks done. So I'm going to share the draft board so everyone can jump in and see things now as we currently stand. But we have started 2 rounds through. We have Justin Fields, we have Christian McCaffrey. First round, kind of as you would expect. It would have been an interesting conversation for us if Cooper Kupp had him at 1 more pick. He went 1 pick before us in the second round, but Justin Fields getting to 9. He feels like the last quarterback in that kind of tier. Personally, I would take him over the likes of Justin Herbert, who went at 7. Travis Kelce went 1 pick before us. Then we get Trevor Lawrence. So as we were discussing that first pick of Justin Fields, it was between him and Jamar Chase, who did go at the 112. The tools on the site saying, and this is what we're going to do probably, Shawn, throughout this draft today, is maybe wait a little bit on quarterback. We have got ourselves into some 0 quarterback builds in these Superflex contests, and it has done well for us at times. But last year, for example, the team that got to the final was a Jalen Hurts team, and then we had some quarterbacks later on in that one. Looking at who we may get here, Shawn, in the 3rd round, anyone standing out as a exciting player that you're hoping gets back to us? This format as well, just as we kick it off, is the same amount of players started as the regular tournament over at the FFPC, but there is one super flex, and that is that it transfers from a flex to a super flex. So you're not gaining an extra flex spot. You are just changing one of them. So when we talk about some of the 0 RB drafts that we would do, not as advantageous here because running backs, kind of getting a little bit of a boost from that. And we talked, Shawn, on our redraft podcast that came out on Friday about this maybe being the year for reverse 0 RB. But what that means in this format is there is lots of prime chances to get those running backs and load up on that position as well. So we are 2 picks away, Shawn. How are you feeling with Garrett Wilson in the queue here at the moment?
Yeah, I love this start. And Justin Fields is probably a safer version, or at least a more established version of what we got last year with Jalen Hurts. And so to be able to go Fields and McCaffrey, I mean, that's really the perfect start. I mean, that's, I think, the best possible start you can get, because Fields is really a top 5 pick in this format, and then you're able to put him with McCaffrey. So I love that we got the 109. It worked perfectly. We are set up to do similar things to what we did last year. Colm, Derrick Henry was actually on that team and unfortunately didn't play in the finals because of the weird way the schedules fell out. He is available here, but I do think that a pick like Garrett Wilson, especially since we already have Christian McCaffrey, is probably even more fun.
Yeah, that's the way I would like to go. And, if we had got Cooper Kupp in the first round, wouldn't be against Henry here. But as I was touching on, looking at the ADP before we kicked this draft off, as we move through it, like Etienne in this format's a 5th round pick, for example. Stevenson's a 5th round pick. Walker's a 6th round pick. Breece Hall's a 6th round pick. Javonte Williams a 7th round pick. James Cook in the 8th round. There's so many options as we go through to get those running backs. So to have an opportunity to get Wilson there, that's just 1 pick after where he is going by ADP at the moment. So nothing outrageous, but Henry, who is going running back 7 in this format, usually goes about 3 picks before us. He has lasted beyond us. Anthony Richardson goes off the board. It'll be interesting, Shawn, as well to track how teams start off. So far, there is 2 teams that have started quarterback, but one of those teams has then drafted CeeDee Lamb with Dak Prescott. The other one of those teams has gone on to go quarterback with Justin Herbert, Kirk Cousins, and Daniel Jones. And then 2 teams at the back of the draft haven't gone quarterback, but through those opening 3 selections have 2 quarterbacks. So it'll be interesting to see who really invests in the quarterback position as we move forward. It is a point where we do tend to try and wait on that second option. So quarterback's getting a little bit rich in this draft, but what that should leave us with a nice opportunity here, Shawn, is who comes back to us in the 4th round. Devontae Adams, somebody we're not actively really targeting this year, but he's a mid-third round pick, and this format goes at the back just before we even had to contemplate potentially selecting him. But some of the options that may get back to us here, Derrick Henry would be in the conversation if it comes back to us in the 4th round. Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave, Jonathan Taylor. There's lots of options here for us. Devontae Smith. Derrick Henry does go to the Devontae Adams drafter. So 2 picks away, Shawn. The players in the queue are Waddle, Olave, Taylor, and Smith. Who is your preferred option here that if they make it back to us? And
well, probably Waddle. And for the reasons that you mentioned there, where we have such, I don't know if embarrassment of riches, but embarrassment of opportunities late to get those running backs to build up that position. Now, the thing that we see in the Superflex, and I love playing this contest, Colm, because I think it's arguably the most fun contest out there, and you should be prioritizing fun. It's a $35 entry, and that makes it very viable for us as we go through and try to do a handful of teams. The other element here is that I think that the Superflex tournament, because it gets a little bit less overall attention, and because the roster construction explorer is so dynamic in terms of the actionable takeaways it has for you in this specific format, that, if you're an OT listener and are wanting to get in some tournaments, wanting to get in some drafts and thinking, what's the best thing for me? I strongly encourage people to think about this one, pull up the roster construction explorer, look at some different builds that you can potentially go through. And Colm, it's a lot of fun to get to this point in the 4th round and have a choice between Chris Olave, who does have not necessarily breakout because he was so fantastic as a rookie, but secondary breakout upside, or you can grab a falling Jonathan Taylor. I mean, to put together a team where you have Christian McCaffrey and Jonathan Taylor on the same one, along with Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson, I mean, that doesn't really seem like it should be possible. I'm pretty tempted to go that direction. Who's your preference here?
Well, my preference is to take Olave, and that's based on what we discussed there. I just think there's too many opportunities. The other player I would pitch for would be TJ Hawkinson. We seem to always cross that line at some point, Shawn, but Taylor and Christian McCaffrey on the same team is very tempting, very exciting, but I think we're going to be faced with a number of other running back options moving through. If you want to, I'll let you pull the trigger. This is the one... the big advantage to me here over at the FFPC is I'm logged into the account also. So I do have some of the controls, but I'm going to let Shawn hit the selection button on most of these as we move forward. I may have to try and sneak in some picks as we move through here, but less pressure than the underdog draft. Shawn, it is, that seems like a pipe dream, last season, 2 seasons ago, to have Taylor and McCaffrey on the same roster, particularly doing it, although in Superflex in the 2nd and 4th round, but I will admit I was tempted. How do you feel about after passing that up?
Yeah, well, now I think there's pressure on Olave to not let us down, right? The element that you kind of alluded to at the beginning, where that flex takes away a wide receiver spot, that super flex does, I think that pushes in the direction of considering the second running back here. Last year, one of the things that we did was to select Derrick Henry and Breece Hall. Unfortunately, Breece Hall was injured, or that team that was in the finals would have been even a lot more exciting. I think that if we had Breece Hall still going on that team, then you get to week 17 and to have both Derrick Henry and Jalen Hurts out, that would have been devastating. As it was, you're kind of thinking, well, we probably can't match the top teams anyway, or not necessarily that, but just, I guess you could see it all coming, right?
The upside, the upside was getting drained out of that team as it went along through the playoffs, and the if it was a train, some of the wheels were loose and some of the wheels had already come off, as we went along. But there was a lot of power in it. You mentioned Breece Hall being out. Jalen Hurts obviously missed those last couple of games. It was a really exciting team that just didn't get there in the end. But we'll see, Shawn. This is going to be one to watch, Jonathan Taylor versus Olave, to see how that plays out over the season. I'm sure. Hopefully they both are winners on the year. Hopefully that's the way we do. Devontae Smith going off the board. to the Jalen Hurts draft are very interesting. It's a Jalen Hurts, Nick Chubb, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Joe Mixon team. I'm not blown away by the running backs, but very interesting stack there. By ADP, Devontae Smith is usually the 205, so he was in conversations for us, makes it all the way back to the 412. But that's going to be interesting to track that team as well. Shawn, I am interested here. There's I don't know what we call this strategy so far. The team in the 7th is a 4-quarterback build through 4 rounds. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
Yeah, and again, it's important to realize and remember what you can do, and that those quarterbacks can all be in there. If they stay healthy, you're wasting some of your picks. If they get hurt, then your team is still wasted because you didn't draft enough upside with the other selection. So you definitely don't want to do that. You don't want to think about, how am I going to hurt some of my league mates? Because your goal is it's not just that you're needing to beat 11 other teams and you don't want to torpedo yourself, but you're trying to beat the entire field. And going with the 4 quarterbacks here is very clearly not the way to do that. Kind of getting back to what the Roster Construction Explorer tells us, taking the QB in 1 and then waiting until the 6th or 7th for your QB2 is the way to play it. Now, one of the things that is problematic when a team starts with the 4 QBs, and you really hate to see, is that now it does put QB pressure on everyone else. So we have to be a little bit more aware of what we might do. But Colm, we're now on the board here, and one of the reasons to not take Jonathan Taylor last time through is that Breece Hall does come back to us. Travis Etienne also there. Do you have any other direction you're looking at taking this pick?
No, running back. You'd be looking down towards Jerry Jeudy, but I think the clear pick here is the running back options. Najee Harris is top by ADP, but he's not somebody that we'll be selecting here. Etienne in the mix too. The Breece Hall dip as well. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, obviously, with Dalvin Cook since signing with the New York Jets. But I just think, we can look and be concerned about week 1. We can look and be concerned about week 2, but Breece Hall and the talent that we were able to see last year, and obviously had the injury, the upside for him to still run away with this backfield. And I've talked about this on a number of occasions, Shawn. A running back getting all the work was something that we used to dream of 8, 9, 10 years ago, back when you originally penned the Zero RB article. But now that isn't something that happens. And if it's a case that Breece Hall gets 65% of the work and Dalvin Cook is diving in there and getting 20, 30% along with the rest of the guys, the upside is huge for Breece Hall. And outside of Jonathan Taylor, I don't think I've been as excited about watching a running back over the last probably 5 years. That came into the league. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey came in just before that. I am very intrigued to see who does get back to us here in this next pick, though, because I mentioned Jerry Jeudy. This is the range where you would see a Kyle Pitts go off the board, Dallas Goedert. Travis Etienne, though, if he makes it back, is going to have to be in that conversation as well. How do you want to proceed here with this particular draft? How about those tight ends? You got out of jail. You didn't have to draft TJ Hawkinson. And I like to do this because Shawn loves TJ Hawkinson. But I think I just love him more. And I will say the team out of the 4th spot who is auto-drafting, but I would assume that it is off their rankings or off players that they have added in. But it's a Josh Allen, Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Jonathan Taylor, TJ Hawkinson team. So that is a pretty nice go at it as well. Jerry Jeudy does go, Shawn. 1 selection away. Etienne is an option here. Kyle Pitts. They would be my 2 preferred options. Anyone else in play for you?
Yeah, I think you can look at Brock Purdy here, especially because we have a lot of teams in front of us in terms of this big stretch from our pick to when we get back on the clock in round 7, where you have 1, 2, 3 teams with only 1 QB. You also run the risk of hitting these teams who have 2 QBs but want to go to a 3rd because they know it's not going to come back to them in the next round. So there's quarterback pressure because that team does go with 4, and yet if we pass just by passing, we're going to have an extra quarterback who is still there. I always like to go big, go for broke, and so I do think for me this is Etienne or Pitts.
Yeah, I'm glad that's the way you went, because that was which do you want to go with, though? I think there is, again, as I mentioned, going to be opportunities for running backs as we move through these next couple of rounds. I do think that this range where you see Kittle, Pitts, and Goddard go off the board is a real strong area for tight end. So I would probably lean towards Pitts and tight end premium. Is that the way you want to go?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and take Pitts here. He, again, is just a massive upside play. He fits with one of the quarterbacks who will be looking at, hopefully will get back to us in 7. That would be Desmond Ridder. The tight ends are not as valuable, or the elite tight ends are not as valuable in the Superflex format, at least in the recent past, when we think about how that contrasts with the regular tournament. And in some ways that is surprising, because in this tournament, with the QB slot of that Superflex spot, potentially taking out, again, as you mentioned, that regular flex and making it so that if you just say, okay, there's a second QB that's a starter, then we've lost a starting position for running back and wide receiver, and tight end at that point then represents a larger percentage of the overall starting lineup between running back, wide receiver, and tight end. But the thing that people are not necessarily looking at here, and I sort of included this when I was writing about the Superflex Dynasty tournament, so the RV Triflex format, and how you want to approach QB, is that in a lot of leagues, and in the FFPC leagues in particular, as we're drafting here, and as you think about with the RV Triflex, in Superflex, the QB scoring is neutralized a little bit. And because of that, it makes elite running backs and wide receivers viable plays in the Superflex position, which, again, the team that takes the 4 QBs early is probably not thinking through that properly, because when you take non-QBs to set yourself up for that, you have more flexibility than if you are focused in specifically on the quarterbacks as the only way to play it. Because the running backs and wide receivers are viable in the Superflex, those guys actually get that little bit of a bump, and that is my conjecture in terms of why we don't see tight ends make as big an impact here. And specifically, again, talking about the elite tight ends. The other thing is just that Travis Kelce now becomes so expensive, and his impact in the recent past is neutralized again a little bit in Superflex. So we think through all of those types of things. One of the things that the Roster Construction Explorer does still tell us, though, is that you want a high volume of the tight end. So as we go through this, Kyle Pitts won't be the last player we take at that position by any stretch. We're probably trying to get to 4 or even 5 tight ends. There are a lot of fun guys late. Colm, as I was discussing that, the disappointing thing that did happen is that Desmond Ridder goes at the 6'10".
Yeah, Desmond Ridder went, and Brock Purdy, who you mentioned as well, that is a potential option at that last pick, did also go. So looking by where they usually go, Shawn, though, Brock Purdy would be, a 5th round selection in this, but that is a little bit early for our boy Desmond Ridder. So that obviously pushes somebody a little bit closer to us, hopefully, as we move through it. I think it's going to be a draft where we wait and see what options become available when we are on the clock, rather than actively pursuing some of these quarterbacks. I think there's an opportunity as we move through here in this next 2 selections. Sam Howell's obviously going to enter the conversation, named as the starting quarterback for the Washington Commanders, but there's some very strong players both at running back and wide receiver available through these next 2 selections. I think it will make it to us, and that was part of the reason for we skipped on Jonathan Taylor to get Chris Olave, because I did think we were going to have a multitude of options. We could have went with Hall and Etienne, but I still think we're going to have options as we move through the rest of this draft at running back as well. Will possibly come back to be a tricky conversation when we recap this draft, what happens at quarterback the rest of the way. But yeah, I think it's I'm still very excited with how it's set up, and I'm very much willing to push that quarterback further. I would have hoped that Ridder had made it towards us, but I'm good with where things are set up here at the moment. Since that last selection, Shawn, Terry McLaurin, James Conner, Travis Etienne, Brock Purdy, George Kittle, Desmond Ridder, DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Watson, Javonte Williams, Damian Pierce, DJ Moore, Mike Williams, all off the board. Outside of the quarterbacks and ETN, my favorite target there that could have potentially got back to us would have been Javonte Williams. There is 4 more selections before it comes back to us. Some of the names here that will be potentially available, they may go before it gets back to us, but Drake London, Deontay Johnson, Brandon Ayuk, Sam Howell, Chris Godwin, James Cook, some of the names that will be going in this particular zone. It is around the range, Shawn, where Howell would come into that conversation that we may be looking towards him. He's usually in that exact area in the 7th round, but Ayuk, Johnson, Drake London, all 7th round picks usually go before him. Would you be looking to push towards a quarterback here, or are you looking to take some of the skill position players here?
I think it's really hard to pass on Howell if he comes back to that spot. And one of the nice things that we have seen is that 2 of the other drafters who selected a QB in round 1 have not taken a second as it gets back to us. So that helps in a big way. I think the question may end up being a little bit more, what do we do at the 804? Because at this point, it seems fairly likely that taking 2 QBs would be a strong possibility. And it's always a reminder that when you do pass on the QBs in Superflex, you still are probably going to be in a range where you like the players at receiver and running back that you have to pass on when you do eventually take your QB. So that's the other element of it, right? We get a Christian McCaffrey, a Garrett Wilson, a Chris Olave because we wait, but you're probably going to give up a Brandon Ayuk, a Deontay Johnson, a J.K. Dobbins if you make the pick here. But Colm, I do like Howell here.
I like Howell a lot. The one thing you could potentially try to risk here, it would be a risk, all 3 teams drafting after us before it would come back have all 2 quarterbacks at this point. They may go for a 3rd quarterback. Breece Young and Kyler Murray would both be, and Jimmy Garoppolo are all by ADP ahead of Sam Howell if you wanted to risk it. If you don't want to risk
a player who is worth that?
Not particularly. Let's go for Howell. Let's do it. Okay. I would have said that, you could take Deontay Johnson or Brandon Ayuk there, and you're hoping that Howell gets back. The part I would really hope now is that Deontay Johnson, Brandon Ayuk, or Chris Godwin come back to us, one of those 3 selections. It would have been one of those 3 guys I would have pushed to take, and it's just a game of see who goes here now in these next couple of selections. It's always a dangerous game. It's always a dangerous game to play that, where you're playing a game of, I don't know if this is a saying in the US, but we say you're playing a game of chicken, where you're kind of going head on into dangerous territory and who blinks first kind of in that situation. But it can't, Kyler Murray goes to the next drafter. So there is a chance that could have been Sam Howell as well.
And I want to run by you the idea here of taking Cook or J.K. Dobbins instead of a receiver, in part because the running backs are, again, more valuable in Superflex than they are in the regular tournament. The other thought that I have is that once Cook and Dobbins are gone, I think we still have a tier of receivers that are extremely dynamic. That's one of the things that we saw in the ship chasing draft that I had the privilege of participating in last night, where we took Dobbins in the 6th, but then really liked our receiver selections in 7, 8, 9. I don't know that after Dobbins is gone, I like another receiver to get to 3 like really big time running backs through 8 rounds, and to also have the 2 QBs, to also have those 2 early wide receivers, to also have Kyle Pitts. I mean, for me, then we would be set up to where at this point on, and I mean, to be in round 8 and already be saying, okay, we can now just take best player available the rest of the way. That's a really nice feeling to have.
Yeah, it is. And as you said, that a few of the names have gone off the board. Brandon Ayuk, Deontay Johnson went off the board along with Miles Sanders, Kyler Murray, but J.K. Dobbins, Shawn, also off the board. And when you're saying that, I'm looking through the ADP here, and we are in a pretty sweet zone for running backs. James Cook now being the last name left in that. But when we look into the following round, I mentioned Chris Godwin. He's usually a mid-8th round pick, but then you have Pickens, you have Mike Evans, but you're moving in then to, this is the guy Shawn's talking about, it's JSN. But Jahan Dodson is there as well. It does dry up a little bit at running back outside of DeAndre Swift. So I think that's a very, very valid point, Shawn, that you've made. And David Montgomery goes off the board, which leaves Cook open for us if that is the direction we want to go. And I think that you've talked me around into that, and the ADP, what we're looking at in the next 2 rounds, really feels like a wide receiver zone. So I'm on board with that.
Well, the other kind of crazy thing that has happened here is that Bryce Young has made it all the way. Do you have any interest in grabbing the third quarterback with a lot of the players who will be left? If we don't, I mean, we're probably looking at Tannehill or Baker Mayfield as the third guy, or just sticking with 2, which I think is a viable option.
Yeah, I'm willing to risk that unless you have a strong play for Young. It's not. He's not somebody I've actively been trying to draft. Have you been taking much Young in your best ball drafts?
No, I have hardly any at all. But I do think that of the 3 offenses with the rookie quarterbacks, that's the one where I think we could get some outperformance. And by that, I simply mean I think that they could be better than people are expecting. And if that's the case, I mean, he's not surrounded by great weapons, and yet at the same time, someone like a DJ Chark, if he were to stay healthy, is a pretty dynamic receiver. You've got a solid coaching staff. The tricky part with Young is that it almost certainly is going to be through the air, and if your team isn't projected to score a lot of points and you don't run a lot and you have mediocre receivers, like what is really the upside? And that, again, is where we come back to in the Superflex format, where the passing QBs especially have their scoring levels knocked by the fact that you have to get 25 passing yards for a point instead of just 20. And people think, well, I mean, how big of a deal could it make? But it can actually change the scoring level by 2 to 3 points per game, which when you're looking at the advantage that they potentially have over running backs and wide receivers, that brings them down into it. Dave Caban has just updated the range of outcomes tool. It has more features. It lets you look at more of these formats, including the FFPC Superflex format. So if you want to get a feel for how the QB scoring overlaps with, contrasts with running backs and wide receivers, make sure you pull that tool up and take a look.
And I will jump in there to give a plug. Dave also did a kind of tutorial that is now up on the RotoViz YouTube channel for the range of outcomes tool. So if you are subscribed, obviously you can find it over there. If you're not subscribed, please do subscribe. We passed 2,400 subscribers this week, but that there tutorial is available there from Dave as well to show you how to use the tool if you haven't been in there already. But awesome work from Dave.
I also think here, Colm, as we are moving through round 8, we see the decision from these other drafters to pass and take risks at QB. Those have mostly panned out, I would say. The Joe Burrow drafter gets Jimmy Garoppolo as his second. I think that Las Vegas offense is probably a little bit undervalued. The drafter who grabbed Justin Jefferson early and then Geno Smith in round 2 has been able to add both Desmond Ridder and Mac Jones. The Patrick Mahomes Tua drafter, probably if I'm in that spot, I would pass on CJ Stroud. I'm sure that the Jalen Hurts drafter was hoping to have a few more options there. It may be the drafter out of the 101 who does get caught out a little bit, because now the 2 quarterbacks remaining really are just Ryan Tannehill and Baker Mayfield. He does take Tannehill. Whether or not Tannehill is able to deliver this season, I think, is going to depend in no small part on whether or not Treylon Burks is able to come back healthy within the first couple of weeks of the season. So, I mean, that could very easily still be the right play. When you look at Tannehill and his athleticism, the weapons that he has, is that a better pick than any of the other plays in round 8? I think you could make that argument. Now, I really do like Mac Jones, so I think he is someone who also should have gone a little bit earlier. But when you get Hurts, you get Tannehill, and you were able to add in 3 running backs and 3 wide receivers. Now they select Evan Ingram with the 901. That's a very well-balanced build that hits a lot of the objectives that we talked about.
Yeah, I think they've started a really nice job. They did get squeezed a little bit. I think when it got to the point where we were talking about the Breece Young selection, he went on the next selection after that, and I don't think they were expecting 5 quarterbacks to go before their selection, so they probably felt a little bit panicked there with the pick. that they do select, and Evan Ingram, I think, is a great selection. He is usually going at the back end of the 7th round, so to get him there at the 901 is a really nice selection from them. It is a case, Shawn, as well in this format. You mentioned Baker Mayfield being a quarterback that's left, but after Baker Mayfield goes in by ADP at the 1004, there is no other quarterback selected on to the 15th round where Jameis Winston goes off the board. So it is a real chasm at this point once it goes past. I just think, the likes of James Cook, and we'll see what the options are when they arrive back to us here. But I think in terms of the quarterback upside that is there after Sam Howell is quite limited. Kyler Murray obviously might miss the start of the season, but if he's your quarterback tree, there's upside with that as the season goes along. That was one pick after hours. JSN goes off the board, Shawn. That was somebody who obviously was a priority here for us moving through, but we are 2 selections away. We do have a multitude of other options in the queue at the moment: DeAndre Swift, Dotson, Addison, Marquise Brown. Shawn, this is also a zone where Pat Freiermuth goes. I know you mentioned, tight end not being as important overall, and it's kind of the volume, so it probably will pass on that now that we have Kyle Pitts on the roster. A couple of interesting options here coming up. You have DeAndre Swift at the top of the queue. I probably would lean to Dotson if that comes to it, but there is a chance here that we take Swift and Dotson still makes it back to us then at the next selection as well.
Yeah, we're trying not to jinx Dotson by putting him at the top of the queue. He's the absolute perfect pick to give us a wide receiver 3 who fits in there with Sam Howell. One of the things as we look a little bit further down the line and talk about whether or not we would take Freiermuth, I do like Colm Kmet this season. I think that you have a very wide range of outcomes with him. Maybe the team simply doesn't pass enough overall. Maybe the arrival of DJ Moore really knocks that down. I think that Darnell Mooney and Chase Claypool are very slightly undervalued in their own rights. So I actually like all 4 of the Bears receiving options. So that's one reason why we wouldn't necessarily have been looking at Freiermuth, who was the top guy on the board by ADP. He does go 1 slot ahead of us. That does push our primary target, Jahan Dotson, to us. Anybody else we should be looking at here, Colm?
No, I think Dotson fits perfectly with this. I think so far there's a lot of things that we've done, Shawn, throughout the draft where we've locked around 2 rounds ahead. You made a perfect call there with the Cook selection, and obviously we hope that JSN would get back to us. That didn't happen. Went 3 selections before us, but we have been able to kind of play it out through checking those zones, seeing what will be available ahead, and making, I think, educated decisions as to who we would like to take at that point. And after the turn where Evan Ingram went off the board, it was Pickens, Pacheco, Evans, Madison, JSN, Dillon, and Freiermuth. So we'll see what happens now, Shawn, as we make the turn again. But I'm very excited how this has played out through those opening 9 rounds. There's not a huge amount that I would change. I think those decisions that we made have kind of all worked out. Anything so far that you would be considering changing at this point?
No, I don't think so. And, to have Justin Fields with Kyle Pitts opposite him in week 17, you love that element of it. To have Sam Howell and Jahan Dotson with Christian McCaffrey opposite them in week 17, even without even necessarily making that the priority component of how we were looking this team together, we're focusing a little bit more on specific targets and structure to have those elements as well. And part of the reason that we have a few of these specific targets is because from a best ball perspective, we've been prioritizing these players on teams who fit together nicely. But I mean, this is really a dream draft so far for me. And we're going to continue to get these really cool wide receiver options in the next couple of rounds, I think. And one of the questions for us will be, how early do you want to go after a Quentin Johnston, for example?
It is certainly going to be a question, Shawn. Gabe Davis goes off the board after DeAndre Swift. I was really hoping the Swift gets back as we continue to fill in those running back options. But we have a little bit of flexibility as to what happens. You're making the question as to how early you want to go for a Quentin Johnston. Are you talking about this early? Is that how early we're looking to go for it?
Yeah, I mean, his ADP would suggest that there is a chance. for him to come back around. But I would say that it's unlikely. And so we have to kind of make that choice of going with him directly over Jordan Addison or not. I do have him ranked above Addison, but we also have a situation where, we might take this opportunity to get a little bit of Addison if we want that. Colm, I have Addison, Marquise Brown, and Quentin Johnston in the queue. You've added Cortland Sutton. Marquise Brown goes one spot ahead of us. Anybody else that we should be looking at? I think Zay Flowers is also an interesting pick at this juncture.
I would prefer the other names that you mentioned, and part of me is trying to play the ADP game and see if Quentin Johnston could potentially slip his way back. I don't think that will happen. If we were going to do that, we would take Addison here and hope that he gets back. But I'm not against taking Quentin Johnston here either. We haven't drafted much Addison together though, Shawn, so I'm open to doing that here as well.
Yeah, let's take the plunge on Addison.
We've drafted a lot of Quentin Johnston.
We have. So this is a good opportunity to take the other young stud receiver. We also have obviously a lot of JSN. So to get our portfolio a little bit balanced out with Addison here, Colm, there were some things that pointed in different directions in his prospect profile. We had Scott Barrett on. We had Patrick Carrain on. We talked to Travis, obviously. Danny Kelly. So many great college football analysts and draft prospect analysts. And one of the things that did come up with Addison is that perhaps a little bit of his production was manufactured. You pull up the Sports Info Solution stats and you see that his yards per route, just okay for a prospect with the other things in his profile. And so again, you're thinking, well, if a little bit of the production is manufactured and he's also just getting so many routes in order to get this, pretty gaudy yardage total, especially that he had at Pittsburgh, maybe that's a tiny bit of a red flag. And yet, he was just so good, so young in college. And I don't think that we want to wipe that away with nitpicking. And then you watch him in his first preseason game, and you're like, that guy is smooth as silk, right? You watch him toe tapping on the sidelines. This is the type of player a little bit like, say a slightly smaller version of Keenan Allen, where you just expect him to be open from day one to the last day that he's on an NFL football field. At this price, wide receiver 37, it's a lot of fun to add him to the roster. Yeah,
and the other part as well, and I know it's not the main part when we're talking about it, Justin Jefferson could unfortunately get hurt, but he's landing in a situation where teams can't double cover him. Sometimes we see rookies come in and it's very hard for them to get open because of coverages, but I can't see landing in a much better situation opposite a wide receiver to free things up here than that in Minnesota. So we'll see how that plays out, Shawn.
Colm, you've put Cortland Sutton into the queue as well. I have been pretty off of him with how poorly
I'm going to debate this. I'm not sure I did put him into the queue, but I'll accept responsibility if that is the call.
Okay, so probably what happened here is that I misclicked earlier. Cortland Sutton is in the queue column. Any thoughts there? He's not necessarily been a target. We love Jerry Jeudy and Marvin Mims, but Cortland Sutton is a guy who does have a little bit of training camp buzz. If that Denver offense really took off, he could be a beneficiary. Once we get into round 11 here,
I've always had a soft spot for Sutton. I will hold my hands up for that, but he isn't somebody this year that I've drafted that much of. It isn't hard to paint the picture, the things work out for him, but we talked on a recent show as well about some of these players when they do drop off that little bit, it is not usually a case that they bounce back to exactly what we're hoping to get. So it feels like we might be sliding him into that category, but I still have a little bit of a soft spot, Shawn. We are one pick away. I'm hoping this doesn't have to come into the conversation. I'm hoping that it's a case that Quentin Johnston doesn't get drafted with this pick, and then we will be very excited.
We will. And you look at some of their guys available. Elijah Moore is still here. Treylon Burks went to that drafter in 106, which I think you can point to his team and say that that's a dream draft. Right now, through 11, the players are Joe Burrow, Stephon Diggs, Tony Pollard, T. Higgins, Ramondre Stevenson, Travis Etienne, Drake London, Jimmy Garoppolo, JSN, Brandon Cooks and Treylon Burks,
It's
if we're out of the
RotoViz
sixth spot,
draft,
I mean, that could be our team. So it's going to be a challenge to beat them. We hope that, we hope to make a few mistakes, right? Just consider continuing to pass on tight end. Maybe that could be a weakness. But we're looking here. The pick was Chigakonkwo. That does move Quentin Johnston to us. Colm, this pick is a no-brainer.
This is a no-brainer. This is a dream. When we pass up on the decision of who to draft in the previous round, why not just draft both of those guys, Shawn? That's usually a nice thing to happen.
It's perfect. And when you're that far away, it doesn't seem incredibly likely. But as I mentioned, his ADP is before that, and yet it was within the range where I think you do have to have some guts from time to time. We talk about ADP value in these tournaments, and I think it can be overstated what that does for you. You don't want ADP values to take you off of your guys. You don't want ADP values to take you off of the profiles that give you tournament winning upside. But if you have another selection that makes sense within your build, and maybe it's a player like Addison where you need to get a little bit of exposure, and the player that you would prefer drafting has a chance to fall to you as opposed to being a full round reach, then that's something you definitely want to consider. It helps you manage your exposures a little bit too when you look at it from that perspective, because while we want a lot of Quentin Johnston, we don't necessarily want a lot of him way above ADP. So again, this has been very exciting in terms of how things have panned out to this point. Elijah Moore still on the board. He's been missing some practices. There have been reports that the Cleveland passing game has looked very poor in training camp. I guess until you have Cooper and Moore in there together, I wouldn't be that worried about it. But the idea that Deshaun Watson is going to simply bounce back, when even going back to when he came into the league as a rookie, I mean, there were some warts. You look at RotoDoc's QB model, which didn't like him because of some of the things that were true about his profile. Now, he was somebody who very easily proved the model wrong in his case. And yet you have pass velocity elements with him. You have him as a mobile quarterback, but we know that mobile quarterbacks, as they started to get a little bit older, have trouble maintaining some of that. You don't know where the cliff is going to be for any individual guy. So there's risk there with Watson, and that risk carries over to Amari Cooper, to Elijah Moore, and Elijah Moore himself played poorly last season. Now, a lot of that was the offense and the quarterback play he got in 2022, but we want to keep all of those things in mind when we make this decision. And probably the other two guys that we're really looking at here seriously would be Cole Kmet, the tight end who goes with Justin Fields, or a Sam Laporta.
Yeah, I feel like this is a tight end spot in terms of, again, as I talked about in the draft, looking back at, the tiers in terms of ADP and how things might play out over the next couple of rounds. This is the zone where Kmet and Laporta and Greg Dulcich all go off the board. It would be a little bit of an ADP value on Elijah Moore, but the advantage of also being able to pair him up with Justin Fields kind of strikes me here with Cole Kmet, and listeners will know how much we are big fans of Laporta and Greg Dulcich as well, but Kmet feels like the one that fits in with this roster, and Gerald Everett goes off, which is probably about 6 picks above his ADP. Nothing outlandish there, but I would be more inclined here, Shawn, to lean into the tight ends. The only wide receiver really standing out for me would have been Elijah Moore.
We'll take Kmet, and he is a guy that Blair Andrews has put the finger on as a player where his fantasy points over expectation, I believe, Colm, that he ranked number 3, was either number 3 or number 4 among all tight ends in that stat last year. It's a stat that helps you find breakout players. One of the things when we talk about fantasy points over expectation, and I think we have a little bit of time here before our next pick, that it's worth discussing, is you have a lot of these trendy stats, and the trendy stats are both fun and meaningful. So this is in no way a shot at any of those things. But when we look at fantasy points over expectation, one of the cool things that it does is grab a bunch of pieces that individually are helpful, and then when you combine them are very helpful in understanding what a player's profile is and what that means in terms of the work that he's likely to get the following season. So when you're talking about fantasy points over expectation for a receiver, for a tight end, you're talking about a metric that is going to grab the air yards element, where a player whose targets are deeper is going to have more overall volume with the yardage that that ball travels in the air. We know that that component can be a mild bump for the player. It captures the catch rate, whether or not the guy is actually able to bring the ball in. It captures his ability after the catch, that yards after the catch, that especially for some specific players can be just very, very dynamic. You look at someone like a Jamar Chase, someone like a Deebo Samuel, two of the biggest impact players in all of fantasy football, and it's that yard after catch element that really separates them. And then it also captures some touchdown rate. And so all of those metrics are elements that Blair has pointed to in his research as also being things that are going to be more helpful to you in predicting fantasy points than ADP, where something like a yards per route, a targets per route are more helpful in actually projecting the ADP. Now, this doesn't say that you look at fantasy points over expectation and just draft those guys blindly. But if you have a good baseline, and we all do, right? That's what ADP is for. That's why we have some incentive to grab some guys who are ADP values when we can. But you look at ADP there and you think, well, who would be the players that I might be tempted to prioritize because they have this shot to outperform? And these guys with the great fantasy points over expectation numbers are certainly players to at least consider. You want to do your homework on them a little bit more closely than some of the other guys, because if you're fading them, you need to have good reasons for that. So we grab Kmet here. We know that there's going to be some target competition. We know that some of his other elements in his profile are weak enough that it's pushed him to the 12th round, right? But once he gets there and you're putting him with Justin Fields and you're thinking about it from a tournament perspective, very clear-cut pick.
Yeah, and since that, we did see Sam Laporta go to the team in 6, Shawn, that you mentioned earlier. And if this drafter in 6 is potentially a listener of the podcast or subscribed to RotoViz, let us know who you are. Unveil yourself and let us know. But it's a team is looking pretty sharp so far. It is going to be 9 picks. It's a 1301 here. It's going to be 9 picks to the 1309 when we make our next selection. But there is always challenges, Shawn, when you set out in a draft room and you are at the back end of those drafts. And there's challenges from each spot, obviously, throughout the entire board when you get into the other rounds of the draft. But when the draft order was set for this and I seen that it was the 109, I'm like, this is one that we can have a bit of fun with. And that obviously takes a lot of things playing out. Justin Fields making it to the 9th spot is one of those things, but then being able to build it out the way we have. I think this is, you mentioned at the start, this tournament being a lot of fun to draft in. It is a lot of fun. This team is a lot of fun. And there is more important things as the season goes along. You want it to be fun at this point, but you want it to also build itself into contention. But with what we've done with the 2 quarterbacks, 2 tight ends, we do have 3 running backs, Shawn. And we had talked at the start about, the opportunities to draft some of the running backs. There's a few of those that didn't come our way. Swift would have been one of those, for example. But I'm very pleased with how this team is going forward. And there is some running backs that will be coming up in these next selections as possible options. We're into an area where we talked about Dulcich, at that last, or I mentioned his name at that last pick. He is still not off the board, but I would expect him to be gone by the time it gets back to us. But Bateman is in the queue, but Warren is there at running back, Damian Harris at running back, Rashawn Johnston, Raheem Mostert is all potential options in this kind of next part of the zone. Elijah Mitchell is there as well, but with Christian McCaffrey, I'd be less likely to go in that direction. Any of the running backs really standing out for you? How are you feeling about, what we need to do throughout the rest of the draft? There is obviously 20 rounds coming up, so lots of time left to fill this team out. But how are you feeling about 3 running backs through these opening 12 rounds after what we talked at the start about, the running backs having that little bit of additional value in this format with the Superflex taking up the flex position?
Yeah, it's one where you almost wish that you had taken Jonathan Taylor, because some of the wide receiver values that we've gotten have been so perfect. And we are still in this area of the draft that probably tilts a little bit to the wide receiver. Now, I love Bateman if he comes back to us here. Huge risk-reward play. Obviously, he has, I don't know if he's dropped down the depth chart, but he's lost the ability certainly to solidify himself as the clear alpha in that offense. It now looks like it's going in the direction of Zay Flowers, and that's even if Bateman stays healthy, which has definitely been an open question as we go forward. I think the other name that starts to become pretty interesting, because he's been punished in this draft more than I'm used to seeing, would be a Kadarius Toney. I'm more or less completely out on Toney, and yet once you get to this price, I think that the upside there is pretty interesting, because he's going to be the wide receiver 6 if we were to add him. You don't necessarily need him to score early. You don't need him to be a big factor in the first 6 weeks or so. When you think about who could give you that upside to win the tournament in week 17, because you're going to lose some of your other guys. I mean, one of the things that was so crazy, right? We finished 17 out of the 33 teams, despite the fact that 5 players we drafted in the first 5 rounds did not factor into our lineup for that week. So you're going to need some real depth in most cases to get all the way through. Now, Toney does go there 2 picks ahead of us. He doesn't quite make it. The Dulcich slide is interesting. He's been one of the massive fallers because it's become clear that he's not the starting tight end in Denver, which, I mean, that does a lot of damage to how people are looking at your fantasy profile. And yet you are in all likelihood still going to have enough of a receiving role, going to get enough routes. And as the season evolves, you would really expect the Broncos to go in a different way. So I'm not married to the Dulcich pick here, and yet I think it is a viable way to play it. We could also grab a Jameson Williams, which with the value that he could bring in the second half of the season. Again, because the team is built so well to this point, it does give us quite a bit of flexibility in terms of going best player available and stashing some guys for the playoff run.
Yeah, it would give you that option. The other player, Shawn, Damian Harris, would be the running back that I would be interested in here. Have you much interest in him or Johnston? I think that the play here is Dulcich. Even as things stand, his ADP over the last 4 or 5 days has been the 1201, and we're here at the late 13th round. I think that makes too much sense. And you're looking to win a tournament, and I think him going, if we look through the players, I'm hoping Luke Musgrave is a hit for the Packers, and there has been positive reports, but goes after Musgrave, goes after Johnston, Irv Smith. Okay, we'll say it's fair to go after Laporta, but Gerald Everett, Shawn, who is one of the guys that we have liked in recent years, but I don't make in a tight end premium format in the 13th round. I think the upside is too high to not be factoring him into things here with that decision. I think it would have been a mistake to pass up on him.
Yeah, and partly we have a lot of exposure, and so we want that to be the case. And yet the flip side of it is that sometimes when your original thesis doesn't pan out, but the player is punished so severely in price that now you're actually even getting a better price to thesis ratio than you were originally. You've got to.
Maybe it's just the Denver Broncos. Noah Fant helped us come second, Shawn, a couple of years ago in the main tournament over at the FFPC. But it was a case that throughout the season that was kind of frustrating with the Denver Broncos tight ends. Last year, Alberto had his issues. Maybe it's just whoever the fantasy landscape wants to be the tight end one in Denver just can't work out.
We've got a different coaching staff in place now, so I think this lack of competency is going to be cured. Now, you say that, and you're staring at Adam Troutman as their potential starting tight end. So there are still some things that we're dealing with, but again, the overall price context for the tight ends is pretty crazy. I mean, you have Gerald Everett at tight end 15. You think about what he did last year, and now Quentin Johnston is on the team as well. I don't understand that at all. Juwan Johnson is, just a guy. Dawson Knox is a touchdown play, which can work, and it can work especially in best ball, but we're talking again about the value of these guys in tight end premium. Dulcich's price within the environment that the rest of these guys are going in, I think is really favorable for us. And I would make that claim, even if it doesn't work out. You're going to have to take some calculated risks as opposed to full floor plays. I don't understand the tight end floor plays in these formats, even though part of what you're seeing in the roster construction explorer, where drafting so many tight ends is a winning strategy for you, is at least hinting at the fact that some floor does help. But again, you're trying to find guys who are going to fit into the starting lineup. Your backup tight ends, in order to do that, are going to need to score some points, right? So even when we look back to this idea of how are you feeling the Superflex, you want the upside to be able to have that guy to work in any given position. You just need better players there. So, Colm, we're back on the clock here. We have 30 seconds. We didn't get Kadarius Toney. With that being the case, I think it's time to take a risk on a Chiefs receiver. I like Rashee Rice. Is there somebody else that you're seeing that we should also discuss?
No, it'll be Rice or back to the two running back conversations. I didn't ask you that. Get you to answer with Harris and Johnston. Are you taking Rice over those guys?
I think he's, at least a tier, if not a couple tiers ahead for me. Damian Harris, especially after we already have James Cook, I don't think is the direction that I like to go. My read on this, and I've liked Damian Harris in the past, so this isn't anything where I'm massively selling Harris as a talent, although his season last year was pretty disastrous, is simply that James Cook looks like he's going to be the guy. In some of the drafts
I'll
that
hold
I've
my
been
hands
in,
up. I had forgot we had the James Cook pick when I was making that pitch.
Well, and there's still some possibility that playing those two guys together would work or would give you a little bit of a floor. I think when we get Cook at the price we got him here, where it was after players like, he shouldn't be going behind Rachaad White. That's pretty clear cut, right? You shouldn't be going behind Dalvin Cook, who is a backup. You shouldn't be going behind Miles Sanders, who is not just a guy. He's an elite pre-contact runner, but the Carolina offense is not going to be nearly as favorable for him, and he has Chuba Hubbard behind him. He shouldn't be going behind Miles Sanders. He shouldn't be going behind David Montgomery, although Montgomery is somebody who does appear to be rising in some of these drafts. The Detroit offense is a target for a lot of fantasy managers at this point. They're generating some pretty serious buzz, and David Montgomery is a guy who, he's a big upgrade on Jamal Williams, right? So if you just take what Jamal Williams did last year and try and project yourself ahead a little bit, understand obviously he's not going to get that many goal line touches, but he's a guy who could lead the NFL in touchdowns. So even though I certainly don't have it that way in my rankings, I wouldn't do it myself. I think you can make a better pitch for David Montgomery than some of those other guys, but you have almost a full round and a half of running backs who should not have gone ahead of James Cook. And in a lot of leagues, those players are not now. So when you do get a shot at Cook at that level, you're going to sprint to the podium and make that choice. Roschon is interesting because he probably is the third string guy. He probably is someone who's not going to help you a lot early. The thing that's tricky about it is I do think that you can take Herbert because he's a dynamic runner. The thing with Justin Fields and how the rushing quarterback helps you covers up a little bit just how good he was even the previous year. Khalil Herbert is a plus runner at the NFL level, and he's the established starter. He's probably undervalued. Although, again, in this draft, he goes right after Jahan Dotson. That's, not anything where you're going to jump out of your shoes and say, we have to take him there. But you like Herbert. Foreman appears to be in the mix. He's the cheapest of the three. For Roschon, he probably needs 2 injuries to really go off and win leagues for you. If he just gets one, or if he pushes himself up the depth chart a spot, then he does help. And so I think you do want him on some of your teams. You're just going to want to be pretty price sensitive there. Even if everybody stays healthy, I think that Roschon maybe even has like the tiny edge to be the week 17 starter. Once we get into rounds 14, 15, 16, the week 17 starter is a pretty big deal, right? So if he were to come back around, I like him. I think that Darnell Mooney is a very interesting play, going with Justin Fields, giving you a little bit more of that. Tyjae Spears, someone I'm drafting everywhere. Zamir White, an interesting play with Josh Jacobs holding out. Kendre, even with this most recent injury, once you get to this point in a draft, I think you want to take some big swings. So, Colm, we've pushed running back a long way at this point. We've selected 6 consecutive players without selecting a back. I do think we're going to have some good choices in the final 6 rounds.
Yeah, we're kind of getting into our zero RB territory here, Shawn. So it'll be, and that's the other thing with it being Superflex. It is, those players that you're hoping to usually get in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th round, they are going in the 15th through 17th round. The 18th round, Shawn, is not the prettiest thing to look at in terms of ADP when we get into these drafts as well. But we'll see how it plays out. And this is a range as well where I think that we're set up here for a 2-quarterback build. I think a lot of the guys that go in this range are wasted picks, and I think that will be proven to be the case. But we do see when Jameis Winston goes, we have in round 17, 18, 19, and 20, there is 3 to 4 quarterbacks going in all of those rounds. So that should free up some opportunities. Just out of interest, Shawn, is there anybody that's going in those later rounds of any interest to you? There's not really anything stand out to me. Like, for example, you could take a chance on somebody like Kyle Trask, that he beats out Baker Mayfield or he gets the job throughout the year. But the rest of the picks there are very limited, that they're unlikely to get in there ahead of the starter. Even somebody like a Gardner Minshew, who we thought might have started the season, that's not going to be the case now either. So I don't see anyone of real value here unless Trey Lance makes a remarkable recovery. How are you feeling about these quarterbacks? Any interest of any kind?
I think that you can take Gardner Minshew in round 20 if you have nobody else that you like at that point. Otherwise, going with the 2 QBs and assuming that your other players like a Christian McCaffrey or Breece Hall, that those guys can feed into the Superflex occasionally. Certainly, players like Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, if they do what we're expecting them to do, they can occasionally be in that spot because you have wide receiver depth filling in behind them. We've made it back around. We have sort of a surprising player here as the top player available by ADP. That's Tank Bigsby. And when you look at where Travis Etienne went in this draft, you get a little bit of a sense of the Bigsby buzz and how terrified people now appear to be with Etienne. I'm very, very strongly on the Etienne bandwagon column, and yet once you get to this point in the draft, it seems pretty clear-cut actually to take Bigsby and get that potential upside should anything happen to Etienne. You're probably going to get some touchdowns. You're probably going to get some receptions. He would be the pick for me and get a little bit of that ADP value.
Yeah, 100%. He usually is going in drafts at the mid-12th round, 1207 kind of range. That last pick that we made is at the 1509. So that is quite a significant drop-off there, which is surprising, Shawn, based on the buzz that is obviously going around for him. There's kind of a camp that's on the ETN side, and then there's the Bigsby side, which seems to be getting more and more noise. But I'm a little bit surprised to. There's always, when these things happen during the drafts, what I do is I go in and Google just to make sure there hasn't been some sort of injury news or that, but nothing that I could find before we made that selection. So kind of. We're hoping, Shawn, it's not a pick that's going to balance out the ETN exposure that we have, but I think it made sense at that particular point off the draft. Curtis Samuel did go one selection ahead of that. Would he have been somebody that would have been in the mix there over Bigsby, or is that just too much of a drop down to let it roll past?
I think it's too much of a value to let go by, and I don't know that we need Samuel here. One of the weird things that has now happened in this draft is that the managers appear to have panicked and are taking a bunch of very low-end wide receivers.
Yeah,
and so early. I mean, all of the best picks on the board, other than Marvin Mims, are running backs. I mean, I still might even be a little tempted to take Mims here, but I mean, Tajay is probably my highest roster player across all formats. I think that he's a good pick here. He's the number 2 player by ADP. Roshan is the number 1 player and obviously fits our team. Do you have a preference between those 2 guys?
Roshan, again, is a better ADP value, but I'm drafting both of these guys. I've made the pitch for, I've mentioned Johnston, I think 4 picks in a row here, but I'm good to go with Spears as well. I'm happy with either of those guys.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and click on
and
Roshan
just
again.
The question on you did take Roshan. So I was going to ask the question as I thought you were going to draft Spears. With having Fields and him being a rushing quarterback, any concerns with having a running back in that offense as well, or happy to just take all the rushing work if it does get that way?
I think that you're looking for the best players. I think that when you are looking from a full season perspective, And the first thing that we have to do is win this league. And already, we see, again, this drafter in 6. I mean, they made the first a little bit surprising pick to me when they drafted Hayden Hurst in the 14th, but they come back with Zamir White in 15. That's going to be a tough team to defeat. Now, 2 of the 12 advance. The other rosters are also going to have lots of interesting dynamic things going on. So it's not like it's us against one other team. It's just there's a draft that is jumping out to us as being a good draft. Roschon balancing with Fields and potentially giving you, number one, the elite rushing efficiency, giving you balance within the weeks where if maybe it's a down week for Fields, you're going to have a lot of rushing scores from the running backs in that week. Now, again, the reason that I argued for passing on him the first couple of times is that I don't know that he necessarily is the guy who benefits from that. So that would be the other part that we're looking at. But I do like him once he gets to that price. And it was a situation in this draft where Deontay Foreman went before him. Now, I don't think that's necessarily wrong either. Deontay Foreman is the last running back that we selected recently on that ship chasing draft. And he's someone who is very, very talented in his own right, probably ahead of Johnston a little bit. One of the things that we've heard for Johnston is that the pass blocking could be one of the elements that gets him out there on the field. You don't necessarily associate that with rookies right away, but Johnston's flexibility as a back, I think, probably is going to give him the edge over Foreman relatively quickly.
And just to pull it up again, I know I've mentioned a few of the values here at these running back picks, but you mentioned some of the wide receivers kind of being pulled up here a little bit into the 14th and 15th round in these last 2 sets of selections. But Johnston is, by ADP again, the 1401, and that their pick that we take him at is the 1604. So it's interesting just to see, and it could just be people are getting spooked by some preseason action or some reports that they've seen, but both of those guys at multiple round discounts is a little bit strange at this particular juncture. Makes me question, have we missed something?
Well, Colm, you are on the Google machine over there. So
I thought you were going to say I'm on Twitter because we can't. I don't know. I always wondered, does Shawn have a secret backdoor entrance where he's checking
Twitter
out
account?
Yeah. But maybe
that's a good question, isn't it?
I did get an email, Shawn, recently asking, would it be possible to, set up a kind of charity event where people could bid and the highest bidder would get a tweet from Shawn Siegele once a year.
There are some things we'll have to look at. So
I don't want to put him under pressure here, but I did enjoy that. I enjoy a lot of the interaction we get from the listeners, but that one did tickle me.
So Colm, as we look through these last couple of rounds, just to put some names with it, round 15 at wide receiver, you've got Darnell Mooney, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Adam Thielen, Justin Ross, DJ Chark, Curtis Samuel, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and Van Jefferson. Peoples-Jones, Thielen, MVS, those guys I would say are almost completely undraftable. Now, MVS is a potential starter with Patrick Mahomes. Maybe you're going to get some spike weeks, and yet one of the stats that's been very trendy recently, and I think is a lot of fun, Blair Andrews is going to have a piece looking at some of the elements from ESPN's open score. And I think the conclusion that he's going to draw is that while it is very interesting, these things are, pretty fully accounted for in how fantasy managers are looking at drafts. But it did jump out to me that MVS is a vertical threat. I think that sometimes those guys get hurt in the score because what they're being asked to do on a huge number of snaps is simply to run vertically and stretch the defense. But his open score was incredibly low, which does jibe with our experience of watching the Kansas City Chiefs last year, where he just was not involved in the games. There was one game, had a big game, came through at a key moment for Kansas City. I'm sure they're thinking about that a little bit as they build their game plans for this season. They have unproven players in Rice and Ross. And even I think you have to include Sky Moore in that group. And so the veteran presence does mean something to them. But that entire group, I think, is very tough to make an argument for. And then you wrap back around into 16, you see Isaiah Hodgins, McCole Hardman, Jonathan Mingo. Again, especially in this format where the wide receivers are not quite as important, I would question whether those guys are draftable at all.
So, Shawn, we are now in the 17th round. As we move on through, we will have 17, 18, 19, 20. So there's 4 picks left to go. We have 2 quarterbacks. We have 3 tight ends so far. At running back, we are now up to 5 with Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, James Cook, Tank Bigsby, and Roschon Johnson. And then we have our wide receiver set at 6 with Wilson, Olave, Dotson, Addison, Quentin Johnston, Rashee Rice. So we have 3 tight ends, Shawn. You did mention at the start about the volume being part of the thing that will show up in the roster construction explorer. Are we looking here as we move forward with those 4 selections? Is there anything standing out for you in the RC that we might want to do here? Obviously, we want to get the best players that we can draft, but is there anything else standing out in terms of the overall roster construction?
Well, we do want to get to at least 4, right? You have a relatively small sample with the specific build that we have, where it's the QB1 in the first couple of rounds and then the QB2 after 6. But with that, you have very good win rates overall, which is one of the reasons why we're doing it. But then with 3 tight ends, a 13% win rate, with 4 tight ends, 19% win rate. I mean, you've got to get to 4 here. I don't think that will be a problem. And in a bigger sample, I wouldn't expect, that kind of crazy result going forward. But it's very clear cut that these guys are weapons when we're looking at this Superflex format.
Yeah, I was hoping that we might get into a conversation about Trey McBride. He does not make it to us, goes a few picks before. Marvin Mims was Shawn, was somebody you mentioned about potentially pulling the trigger at the last pick. He has made it back to us, so I feel like there probably isn't much need to have any conversation here.
Well, Mims is a good pick. We do have some other players who are great values. I think that taking Jerome Ford here, he's the second highest player by ADP. I don't know if he comes back and he's a good fit for the team that we have built. Michael Mayer, it's interesting to see Austin Hooper go there. I wouldn't be worried about him at all. This is, again, one of those elements a little bit with the Dulcich pick where you have to be cognizant of what early season depth charts really mean. But yeah, I mean, Mims here for our final wide receiver, I think you like that bet.
Yeah, I think I thought you were just going to say, yeah, that's the pick. Ford is interesting. I think there's some other options that may get back to us, but he may get back. The other one that you mentioned there is Mayer. Obviously, there's 6 picks to go before it gets back to us. I would hope that Ford or Mayer become available for us when it gets back there. It is a zone now when you get into these last 3 selections that if there is players that you really want to get on your team, you can say it's reaching, but I think it's, go and get them at this particular point. Ty Chandler goes in this range as well, Shawn. Zach Evans. But I think there's multiple options here for us. A tight end, Mayer is one. Later on, Logan Thomas would fit in. Noah Fant could potentially fit in here as well. Deuce Vaughn was somebody I had added to the list. He goes off the board 2 picks after us. Let's see how it plays out around the turn here, Shawn. But have you Ford strongly ahead of Chandler and Zach Evans at this particular point?
I do. Zach Evans is somebody that I want to keep a really close eye on, but I'm thinking that he's going to end up being a lot more of a regular season waiver wire pick
selection, yeah,
as opposed to a guy that we can comfortably fit into a best ball lineup. The Evans situation is one where you can just put a hole in your team for the entire season. Now, we're late enough in the draft that any of these guys could be, but when you look at where Marvin Mims was drafted, when you look at where Michael Mayer was drafted, when you look at the role that the Cleveland Browns have intended for Jerome Ford, to be this late in the draft and to have some guys like that is, again, just something that you don't want to miss. It was interesting because we just got both of those players auto-picked at the turn. I don't know if that drafter had to leave and is going to get those 2 fantastic values. Sometimes the auto-picker does a good job.
Yeah, I think that could be what happened. They've picked every single pick throughout the draft, and sometimes it can happen, Shawn. I remember I believe your story is about an internet connection issue, or it was a guy that was out killing a snake outside his house or something like that, I believe the story was. But these things can happen, and you can go on auto draft, and especially when you're at the turn, going auto draft once and the 2 selections are made. So we miss out on both of those guys that we were hoping that would get back to us. In looking through the options, I mentioned Fant. He kind of goes in this. So the other thing I wanted to mention, Shawn, is I've noticed this in a lot of drafts, depending on the draft room you're in, rookies, even versus ADP and what will show up for people who are drafting in the FFPC here, for example, people are a little bit afraid, I think, to draft them, and are letting them fall a lot further than they should. That Marvin Mims pick is another one. Usually goes in the late 15th round. He went to us in the late 17th round. So we're picking up these 2-round discounts, but we missed out on another 2-round discount with Jerome Ford going off the board. Ty Chandler, Shawn, at the top of the queue. Noah Fant goes in this range. We're looking at options that would, fill out the team. You did say when we took Mims about that being our last wide receiver. Are you strong on that? There's only really one wide receiver I would be looking at over these next couple of rounds, and that is Jalen Hyatt. But do you think we're locked in here? That was our last wide receiver at Mims?
No, I mean, if we get to these final 2 rounds and it's really clear cut that Hyatt is the best play, you just want to keep going, best player available. We do have some deep tight ends that I think we like more than the community. And certainly with Logan Thomas fitting with Sam Howell, I think that's the perfect final pick for us, and say final, 19, 20, one of those two.
Yeah.
We have the threat still of a free agent landing in Minnesota, but Ty Chandler was, again, one of the outperformers in the preseason. He was fantastic in the preseason as a rookie. He seems like the guy here who could have the biggest impact. He is also one of the couple biggest values by ADP. Go that route?
Yeah, there's nobody else standing out for me. We did. It was an approach at that last pick that we had, Shawn, when we took Mims. It felt like we have a bunch of options, but they all disappeared very quickly. So 2 picks left to go. I think it's at least one tight end. We'll see if Hyatt gets into the mix. What is the RCE saying about a 5 tight end build?
We're going to have to change the parameters a little bit here. But if we just clear it completely out, it doesn't necessarily like 5 tight ends for this, but again, the sample is very small. In the regular tournament, I've mentioned that it does like 5 tight end. Again, one of the elements that's going to be a little bit different between this and the normal tournament is just that you've got to try and fill that super flex spot. Now, Logan Thomas goes here at 1808. So that is a disappointment. I think it's a good pick. We had the drafter in 6 was the one who took Trey McBride, so that perhaps that isn't a surprise. He does come back with Gus Edwards that I'm a little bit uncertain as to where the buzz for him is coming. Now, we're late enough in the draft that anybody who's going to see the field is a viable selection. He comes after Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who still seems to me to be a potential cut candidate, and maybe being cut would actually help his fantasy value. But the player who's really standing out in Ravens camp is Keaton Mitchell. Now, that guy is really small, and if you are a rookie that the team didn't invest in from a draft perspective, you're a tiny guy at the running back position, how much should we really pay attention to that? But Mitchell is one of these guys who had a crazy prospect profile. And so if you're looking at somebody who probably, was vastly undervalued by NFL GMs, and we're already seeing that. Anytime that someone is that good, and you think of Phillip Lindsay, for example, a very small back, undrafted free agent, goes out and has a couple of, I believe, 1,000-yard seasons, Mitchell would kind of be the next guy in that range for me. He's probably going to make his way onto the zero RB candidates watch list at the very least. And I don't think anybody other than J.K. Dobbins is going to have fantasy value there. I think Dobbins is going to be that dynamic and take that high a percentage of the touches. But if there is more value, I mean, maybe it's just the optimistic streak in me, or this desire to see undervalued players who are great collegiate players like get appreciated. But I think that Mitchell is somebody that anybody who's looking for really deep options for their dynasty leagues, or they're in a strange format, or you just like to be kind of ahead of the curve in terms of thinking through who the next fashionable guy could be, Keaton Mitchell, someone to keep an eye on.
So we do miss out on Logan Thomas. Since our last pick, it was Chandler, Edwards-Helaire, Shepard, Gus Edwards, who you mentioned, Logan Thomas, Kate Otten, Joshua Kelly, Darius Slayton, Rashid Shaheed, and Sam Darnold has just gone off the board. 7 picks till we pick again, Shawn. Obviously, we want to get that next additional tight end in one of these next 2 selections. Top of the list here, kind of for me, would be Noah Fant. Just to read through by ADP, some of the options: Isaiah Likely, Noah Fant, Jelani Woods, Adam Troutman, Darnell Washington, Noah Gray, Daniel Bellinger. It's a limited field of tight ends that we're looking at here. We have taken Cole Kmet so far. Robert Tonyan, former Packer, now with the Bears. He's a deep, way down. If you scroll down far enough, you can find him. But Shawn, there's not really many options here that I'm excited about outside of Noah Fant. Any excitement for the likes of a Jelani Woods?
I think the picture there is too obscured right now to feel comfortable with that. You have a decent receiver core, and then you have the rookie quarterback, who probably is not going to be a pass-oriented type of player. We look at Noah Fant. I guess I'm concerned that they didn't use him very much last year, and now JSN is also in the mix. And so his outlook to me seems, again, very cloudy. You could draft somebody who basically doesn't play. Of course, you're contrasting that with other guys who are fairly far down. When you look up the situation there, people covering Seattle talking about how he's finally healthy, and this is the kind of breakout potential season, or it's the season where he's going to either do it or not. I don't think that comes as a surprise to people. So you have some other interesting names. I think that Darnell Washington has been so dynamic as a rookie in Steelers camp that you might look at him a little bit. I mean, the thing with Fant is, perhaps for me, the bloom is off the rose. He has become a boring pick to me, whereas last year he was an exciting pick. And sometimes the post-hype guys really are the guys to play. And, it's once you've kind of given up that there's value there because everybody else has given up too, right?
Last year we had the Seahawk in the 20th round that was Geno Smith. The 19th round for a Seattle Seahawk and Noah Fant. Maybe even we'll hold out to the 20th round and see what happens. We are one pick away, but
I think we can push him through. Colm, it does come back to receiver, I think, for me here. Looking at the running backs, the guys available: Patterson, Kyron Williams, Prince, Evans, we talked about. Strong, obviously, now a little bit buried. Evan Hall. I think that we're set. I think that we're okay at that spot. So then, if we're looking at receivers, the 2 guys for me would be Jalen Hyatt, somebody we like a lot, or Chase Claypool, someone who gives us that extra little play with our quarterback, and a play where, things seem fairly bleak for Claypool at this point, but as a rookie, this guy was an absolute star. You're talking about in the 19th round with our quarterback, with that week 17 possibility. Do you lean that direction, or do you lean Hyatt?
Yeah, I think if it was a one-off, I would draft Hyatt. But I think, if we want to go with the stacking option, I think it makes sense that we're having that kind of rising ship lifting. I'm doing a lot of analogies here, Shawn, on this show, and I don't think of any of them make any sense. But we'll go all in on the Bears here.
Very nice, very nice.
For you, is it Hyatt versus Claypool 1-for-1? Are you drafting Hyatt over Claypool if it isn't the Chicago team here?
Definitely.
Okay, that's kind of what mine would have been too, but I think it makes sense in the tiebreaker. And that stretch as a rookie, Shawn, was, it looked like it was ready for takeoff for a historic career here for Chase Claypool, but it obviously didn't turn out that way in Pittsburgh.
And especially when there seems to be sort of a discipline element. I think once a guy starts to fall, you're expecting him to continue to slide and probably not resurrect his NFL career. But we don't want to go out and say that that's impossible by any stretch, right? When you are that kind of physical presence and you have a quarterback who profiles as an elite deep ball thrower, you could be the jump ball threat for the team. I mean, they obviously have Mooney, who gets deep very well also, but that's one of the reasons why we have taken Justin Fields in the first place, is that they've added the weapons around him to where it won't just be rushing this year. I think that Justin Fields has a lot better chance to get hurt than the guys who were selected ahead of him. I think that he has a lower floor than the players selected ahead of him. I think he has the ceiling to challenge Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes to be the QB1 this season.
Bold statement, but we'll see how it plays out as the season goes on. I think there's no doubt that if he stays healthy for an entire season, the upside is just enormous. And we've seen flashes of that last year. I'm not expecting 50-yard rushing touchdowns from him on a weekly basis, but the upside of Fields, I think, is undoubted. It's just whether we get to see it at that particular point. After we take Claypool, it is Isaiah Likely, then Cordarrelle Patterson, then Trey Lance. After that, then, as I scroll down the board here, Noah Fant, Shawn does go 2 picks before us. Kyron Williams went off the board before that. So 1 pick before it gets back to us. At this point, for me, it feels like we're not getting a 4th tight end here. Hyatt would be an option. Zach Evans, you mentioned earlier, Gardner Minshew is a potential option. Hit me with your thoughts. We don't have to.
Yeah, I'm very willing to take Hyatt. He seems like the player here who, in a vacuum, you say round 15, round 16, who would make sense there? Probably Jalen Hyatt does. If you get him in round 20, even if he's not the position you necessarily were targeting, you have to take the best player values when you get late in the draft. You have to pick guys who have a legitimate opportunity to score points for you. I mean, again, Zach Evans, I loved him as a prospect. And there aren't too many situations that are a lot better with the Rams having such a weak running back depth chart. And yet, I guess I don't feel comfortable yet with where he went in the reality draft and what has happened so far in camp to say that he has followed through on that thesis to the point where we're suddenly going to pick him. And there are guys here I like. I mean, Sean Tucker, another player where I think he's dramatically undervalued. You know, maybe you look at him. If you need a last round running back, I think that Travion Williams, because he got dinged up, is now not being selected at all, where he's probably still someone who should be going in rounds 15 or 16. But it would be hard for me to not take the upside of a Jalen Hyatt right here. It just, again, it feels like you're getting a 5 or 6 round value.
Yeah, let's do it. And I know, in terms of where you would be ranking him, it is a 5 or 6 round value, but even by ADP, it's another player who usually goes in the 18th round, going in the 20th round. So it feels like in the back half of this draft, Shawn, we've had a lot of players who have fallen down to us, and we have missed out on some of our, priority targets that I would like to get on this roster, the likes of a Trey McBride, for example. A couple of other players that we talked as we went through. Hubbard would have been interesting to get back to us on this roster. Jerome Ford was one we talked about. Michael Mayer was another one we talked about. But realistically, I feel like we have had quite a good bit of fortune in terms of the players that have been available to us throughout this entire draft, and I'm very excited with what we've been able to produce. So I'll go through it first as round by round, then we'll go through it as a team. But it was Justin Fields, Christian McCaffrey, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Breece Hall, Kyle Pitts, Sam Howell, James Cook, Jahan Dodson, Jordan Addison, Quentin Johnston, Cole Kmet, Greg Dulcich, Rashee Rice, Tanks Bigsby. Then we get into Roschon Johnson, Marvin Mims, Ty Chandler, Chase Claypool, and Jalen Hyatt. So that gives us Justin Fields and Sam Howell, just the 2 quarterbacks in this build. We have 6 running backs and Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Tank Bigsby, Roschon Johnson, and Ty Chandler. And then at tight end, it is Kyle Pitts, Cole Kmet, and Dulcich, with Garrett Wilson, Olave, Jahan Dodson, Jordan Addison, Quentin Johnston, Rashee Rice, Marvin Mims, Chase Claypool, and Jalen Hyatt. And Shawn, as we look through this roster, we love to get those young players in, the first and second year players in particular. This roster is rookie. We have really loaded up here in first and second year players. Outside of, we have Christian McCaffrey's in there, Kyle Pitts is entering his third season. Sam Howell is entering his second season, pretty much a rookie. But looking through it, Kmet is one of the real veterans. And you mentioned Claypool. Obviously, he fits that category as well. But this is a young team with extreme upside.
And we don't have any guys who are old, which I always like. I do think that the balance in age and experience in the first 10 rounds is very nice. One of the things you're looking to do when you're selecting the rookies is just to make sure you're not so enthusiastic that you're paying prices that don't make sense. Because once you do that, not only do you have the natural risk of the player being a rookie, but you've drafted him at a level that squeezes out some of the upside. But to get Quentin Johnston at that value, to get guys like Rashee Rice, Tank Bigsby, Roschon, Mims, Jalen Hyatt, to get those guys at values that were, in many cases, fairly extreme, I think mitigates the risk, seeds the team with a lot of upside. And again, you look at the roster construction explorer, the win rate's extremely high for this specific build. It's the reason that we went about it in the first place. But Colm, we also want to understand that past seasons are not going to be a perfect template for what's going to happen this year. But one of the reasons that we like this build, and one of the reasons that the roster construction explorer is so valuable, is that it helps you kind of test your intuition and work through the logic. I think that there are a lot of different individual seasons and a lot of different shapes to positional scoring that work well with this team that we've drafted. This isn't a everything has to work perfectly type of team. That's what you're looking to do in Superflex, where you have so much flexibility in build. This has been a lot of fun. I'm excited to see what happens with it. And again, like I pitched at the start, I would encourage RotoViz listeners to consider this format because it is so much fun, and I would still consider it the most exploitable format out there. So when you have a $35 format with a $50,000 grand prize, and people are not playing it very efficiently, those are the three things you want, right? Fun, inexpensiveness, inefficient drafting. It's perfect for you.
If you can find inefficient drafting from the other drafters and you draft efficiently, that is always a positive sign. I'm interested, Shawn. They may have no connection at all, or never listened to a RotoViz podcast, or never read anything on RotoViz. But the team out of 6 is also the only team to go with the 2 quarterbacks, and I am interested to see who that is. So I'll tweet out this team, and if they haven't seen it on Twitter, we'll see if anyone comes forward. It is Runs N Guns 5 is the name of the team. So shout out to whoever that is. But Shawn, I'm excited for this team. We'll probably do a few more of these as we move forward, but really fun format. I highlight everything that Shawn said there about it, but enjoyed this here. So we'll track this team throughout the season. Hopefully we'll make another run at the finals. We've had quite a bit of fun in this tournament over the last couple of seasons, so we'll see what happens. But we'll have more FFPC drafting, more Underdog drafting, lots of stuff coming your way over the next couple of weeks before the NFL season. So we're excited to bring all that to you. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. And as a final plug as we end the show, we talked today a little bit about the roster construction explorer, how to build teams, how things would look, and also the range of outcomes tool up on the website. I talked about the tutorial that is on YouTube from Dave Cabin. They're available on RotoViz.com. If you want to use those tools, if you want to sign up, get access to Shawn's rankings, Blair's rankings, and all the other content and tools up on RotoViz.com, use the promo code RVRadio2023 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount off a RotoViz NFL Pass. Perfect time to join now ahead of draft season. Get yourself set up to be an efficient drafter, Shawn. That's what we'll say. But until we are back with the next show, have a good one.